The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets across the Tuscan hills in October 1944, turning the roads into rivers of mud that sucked at boots and vehicle tires with equal hunger. Private First Class Daniel Kovacs stood beneath the sagging canvas of a supply tent somewhere south of the Arno River, watching the water cascade off the edges in silvered streams, and tried to remember what dry socks felt like. He'd been in Italy for 3 months now, attached to the 370th Infantry Regiment, and in that time he'd learned that war was less about the dramatic moments of combat than it was about waiting, about cold food and colder nights, about the weight of wet wool against your skin and the way fear became something you carried in your chest like a stone you couldn't cough up. Kovacs was from Pittsburgh, the son of Hungarian immigrants who'd worked the steel mills until his father's lungs gave out, and he'd grown up in neighborhoods where everyone looked more or less the same, talked the same, worshipped in churches that smelled of incense and old wood. The army had been his ticket out, or so he'd thought when he enlisted in the spring of 1943, imagining himself storming beaches and liberating towns, coming home with medals and stories that would make the girls at the dance halls look at him differently. Instead, he'd spent most of his time in a replacement depot in North Africa, then got shuffled to Italy just in time to watch the campaign bog down into a grinding, muddy stalemate that seemed designed to break men's spirits without the mercy of a quick death. And what he hadn't expected, what nobody had bothered to mention during basic training at Fort Benning, was that he'd end up serving alongside Negro soldiers. The army had always kept them separate. Everyone knew that, housed them in different barracks, fed them in different mess halls. They sent them to different theaters or kept them in labor battalions where they could load supplies and dig latrines and stay out of the way of real fighting men. That was just how things were, how they'd always been, and Kovacs had never given it much thought one way or another. Back in Pittsburgh, there were neighborhoods where colored folks lived, and neighborhoods where they didn't, and the line between them was as clear and unquestioned as the line between the Monongahela and the Allegheny. But Italy was different. Italy was desperate. The Gothic Line stretched across the Apennine Mountains like a wall of German steel and concrete, and the American Fifth Army was bleeding itself white trying to break through. General Mark Clark needed every rifle he could get, every tank, every artillery piece. And the neat divisions of race that had seemed so important back in the States started to blur when commanders were staring at casualty reports and wondering how they'd take the next town with half their companies under strength. The 92nd Infantry Division had arrived in theater that summer. An all-Negro division except for its white officers, and men like Kovacs suddenly found themselves in positions where they had to work with, fight alongside, and depend upon soldiers they'd been taught to think of as fundamentally different, fundamentally less. The first time Kovacs saw them was at a forward supply point near Lucca. He'd been sent back with his squad to pick up ammunition and rations, and they'd pulled their deuce and a half off the road into a muddy clearing where several other trucks were already parked. A group of Negro soldiers were unloading crates from a 6x6, working in the rain without complaint, their dark skins slick with water, their uniforms as mud-stained and worn as any white soldiers. Kovacs watched them from a distance, leaning against the tailgate of his own truck while he smoked a Lucky Strike he'd been saving, and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd always assumed. Sergeant Frank Morrison, a lean Texan with a face like sun-dried leather and eyes that never seemed to blink, spat tobacco juice into the mud and shook his head. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, loud enough for the squad to hear. "Giving rifles to boys who ought to be shining shoes." Private Eddie Kowalski, a stocky kid from Chicago with a boxer's nose and a quick temper, laughed and said something crude that made a few of the other men chuckle. But Kovacs noticed that none of them laughed too loud. They weren't quite sure what the rules were anymore, weren't sure what they were allowed to say or think. One of the Negro soldiers, a tall man with corporal stripes on his sleeve, looked over at them with an expression Kovacs couldn't quite read, something between contempt and exhaustion, and then went back to his work without saying a word. The Gothic Line offensive began in earnest 2 weeks later, and suddenly there was no more time for speculation or prejudice or any of the comfortable assumptions that had governed life in garrison. The Germans had fortified every hill, every farmhouse, every stone wall, and taking ground meant crawling through minefields under mortar fire, meant watching men you'd shared cigarettes with that morning get torn apart by machine gun fire in the afternoon. It meant learning that courage and cowardice had nothing to do with the color of your skin and everything to do with what happened inside your head when the shells started falling. Kovacs's company was tasked with taking a village called Sommocolonia, a cluster of medieval stone buildings perched on a hilltop that dominated the valley below. Intelligence said the Germans had maybe a platoon holding it, but intelligence was always wrong, always optimistic. When they moved out in the gray light before dawn, Kovacs could feel the weight of coming violence pressing down on him like a physical thing. They advanced through olive groves and terrace vineyards, staying low, weapons at the ready, For a while it seemed like maybe intelligence had been right for once, maybe the Germans had pulled back in the night. Then the world exploded. Machine gun fire erupted from the windows of the village, tracer rounds cutting through the morning mist like angry hornets, and mortars started dropping among the olive trees with precision that suggested the Germans had pre-registered every meter of the approach. Men scattered, diving for cover behind stone walls and into irrigation ditches, and Kovacs found himself pressed into the wet earth with his M1 Garand clutched against his chest. Unable to move forward or back, just trying to make himself smaller while chunks of stone and shrapnel whizzed overhead. He couldn't see Morrison or Kowalski or any of the others. The world had shrunk to the space immediately around him, to the smell of turned earth and cordite, to the sound of his own breathing harsh and ragged in his ears. He was going to die here, he thought, die in this Italian mud without ever seeing home again, without ever kissing a girl properly, without ever doing anything that mattered. The thought filled him with a rage so fierce it burned away the paralysis. He lifted his head just enough to locate the machine gun nest, a stone building with a red tile roof maybe 70 yards away. That's when he saw them. A squad of Negro soldiers moving up on his left flank using the terrain with professional skill, covering each other's movement with disciplined fire, advancing in short rushes that ate up ground while minimizing exposure. They wore the same uniforms as Kovacs, carried the same weapons, but they moved with a purpose and coordination that his own scattered unit had lost in the first seconds of contact. Their squad leader, a sergeant with 3 stripes and a carbine, was directing them with hand signals, positioning a bar team to suppress the machine gun nest while the rest of his men worked around to the flank. Kovacs watched in fascination and something close to shame. These were the men Morrison had dismissed as shoeshiners, the men Kowalski had made crude jokes about, and here they were fighting with a competence that put his own unit to shame. The bar opened up with its distinctive stutter, raking the windows of the stone building, and the German machine gun fire slackened for a moment. The Negro sergeant seized the opportunity, leading 3 of his men in a sprint across open ground to a position behind a low wall, closer to the village, and Kovacs realized they were creating an opportunity for everyone pinned down in the olive grove. If his own people didn't move now, those men's courage would be wasted. He forced himself up, shouting for anyone who could hear him, and started running toward the village. He didn't think about bullets or mortars or anything except putting one foot in front of the other, except getting to that wall where the Negro soldiers were. He didn't think about being the coward who stayed behind while braver men did the fighting. Others followed. He could hear boots pounding through the mud behind him, could hear Morrison's voice raised in a rebel yell that was half battle cry and half terror. Then he was throwing himself over the wall in a graceless tumble that knocked the wind out of him. The Negro sergeant was right there, pressed against the stones, and he looked at Kovacs with eyes that were completely calm despite the chaos around them. "You boys got any grenades?" he asked, his voice a deep baritone with a Georgia accent that reminded Kovacs of red clay and pine trees. Kovacs fumbled at his belt, came up with 2 Mark II pineapples. Yeah, I got grenades." "Good." The sergeant pointed toward the machine gun nest. "On my signal, we all throw together, then rush the door before they recover." "You think your people can do that?" It was the way he said it, your people. That made Kovacs realize he was looking at the situation backwards, that these Negro soldiers weren't attached to his unit, that his unit was attached to theirs. In this moment of fire and death, the normal hierarchies had inverted, and all that mattered was who could think clearly and who could lead. "Yeah," Kovacs said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Yeah, we can do that." The sergeant nodded once, then raised his voice so the men on both sides of the wall could hear. "Grenades, on 3. 1, 2, 3. They came up together, white soldiers and Negro soldiers, arms cocking back and hurling the grenades in a ragged volley that arced through the air and crashed through the windows of the machine gun nest. The explosions were muffled by the thick stone walls, but devastating in their enclosed space, and the German fire stopped abruptly. The sergeant was already moving, carbine up and firing from the hip as he sprinted toward the building's door. Kovacs was right behind him, his Garand bucking against his shoulder as he squeezed off shots at shapes moving in the smoke. They hit the door together, the sergeant's boots smashing it open, and poured into the darkness beyond. There were bodies on the floor, German soldiers torn by shrapnel, and one man still alive, fumbling for a pistol with hands that shook uncontrollably. The sergeant put him down with a single shot, quick and professional, then moved to clear the rest of the building while Kovacs stood in the doorway, trying not to vomit from the adrenaline crash. Morrison came through the door a moment later, followed by Kowalski and 3 others from Kovacs' squad, all of them wild-eyed and breathing hard. Morrison looked at the Negro sergeant, then at the dead Germans, then back at the sergeant. Something shifted in his face, some wall that had been there crumbling just a little. Hell of a throw, he said finally, and it wasn't much. Wasn't an apology or a recognition of shared humanity, but it was something. The sergeant just nodded, already moving to the window to check for more threats. Better secure this position, he said. They'll counterattack soon as they get organized. They held Sommocolonia for 3 days. A mixed group of white and Negro soldiers who'd been thrown together by necessity and discovered they could function as a unit. They shared rations, shared watches, shared the terrible intimacy of men who might die at any moment. Kovacs learned that the Negro sergeant's name was James Crawford, that he'd grown up picking cotton in Georgia, that he'd joined the army because it was the only job that would let a colored man prove he was worth more than the sharecropper's life his father had lived. Crawford had a photograph of his wife tucked in his helmet liner, a beautiful woman in a Sunday dress standing in front of a white church, and he talked about her in the quiet hours before dawn with a tenderness that made Kovacs think about his own mother. He thought about the universal human need for love and home and the belief that somewhere out there, someone was waiting. Kowalski, who'd made those crude jokes back at the supply point, ended up sharing a foxhole with a Negro private named Thomas Washington, a quiet kid from Philadelphia who'd been a porter before the war. They spent a long, cold night together while German patrols probed the village perimeter, and at some point in those dark hours, Kowalski started talking about his father, about how the old man had worked himself to death in the stockyards. He talked about how the American dream was supposed to mean something, but mostly it just meant breaking your back so other men could get rich. Washington listened, and then he talked about his own father, about Jim Crow laws and lunch counters where a man couldn't sit. He talked about lynchings and voting restrictions and all the ways America found to tell you that you weren't really American at all. The two men didn't become friends exactly, but they arrived at something like understanding. They recognized that the systems that ground men down came in different forms but served the same masters. Morrison remained the hardest to reach. The Texan carried his prejudices like armor, like something that protected him from having to question the world he'd grown up in. And even after watching Crawford and his men fight with undeniable courage, Morrison found ways to diminish it. They did all right, he'd admit grudgingly when someone brought it up, but that don't change facts. That don't change nature. But nature, Kovacs was beginning to understand, was a lie. Or rather, nature was what men called their own learned hatreds to avoid taking responsibility for them. There was nothing natural about the fear he'd felt when he first saw Negro soldiers with rifles. Nothing natural about the assumptions he'd carried about their competence or courage. Those things had been taught to him, carefully and consistently, by a society that needed him to believe them to maintain its hierarchies. And now, in the crucible of combat, those teachings were being burned away by the simple, undeniable reality that a bullet didn't care about the color of the skin it punched through. That courage looked the same regardless of who was demonstrating it. Men who fought and died together had more in common than any amount of propaganda could erase. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day when the Germans launched their counterattack. It came at dawn, as these things always did, a company of panzer grenadiers supported by a self-propelled gun that started, hammering the village from a position on the next ridge over. The first shells collapsed a building on the east side of the village, burying 2 men under rubble. And suddenly the carefully prepared defensive positions meant nothing because the Germans were coming from an unexpected angle. They were exploiting a gap in the perimeter that no one had anticipated. Crawford organized the response with the kind of calm competence that came from some deep well of courage Kovacs couldn't fathom. He repositioned his bar team to cover the new approach, sent runners to pull men from less threatened positions. He personally led a squad to rescue the men trapped under the rubble. Kovacs found himself working alongside a Negro corporal named Davis, the two of them frantically pulling away stones and broken timbers. Machine gun fire kicked up dust around them, and that self-propelled gun kept pounding the village into gravel. They got 1 man out alive, a private from Morrison's squad named Jimmy Aldrich, who'd lost his helmet and had blood running down his face from a scalp wound. The other man was dead, crushed by a falling wall, and there was nothing to do but leave him and get back to the fighting. Aldrich was dazed, barely able to walk, and Davis hoisted him up in a fireman's carry and started moving toward the aid station with rounds cracking past his head. Kovacs provided covering fire, emptying his Garand's clip at German positions, and when Davis stumbled, when he went down on one knee with Aldrich's weight threatening to spill them both into the mud, Kovacs was there to grab Aldrich's other arm and help carry him the rest of the way. They made it to the aid station, a cellar in one of the village's more intact buildings, and laid Aldrich on a table where a medic, a Negro soldier with the Red Cross armband and gentle hands, immediately started working on him. Davis and Kovacs stood there breathing hard, covered in dust and blood, and looked at each other with the recognition that comes to men who've shared mortal danger. "Thanks," Davis said simply, and Kovacs nodded, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Morrison saw the whole thing. He'd been directing fire from a window overlooking the aid station. And when Kovacs came back out, the sergeant grabbed his arm with a grip that was almost painful. Morrison's face was streaked with powder residue, and his eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much. But there was something else there, too, something that looked like the beginning of doubt. "That colored boy saved Aldrich," he said, and it sounded like an accusation. "Put himself at risk to save a white soldier." "Yeah," Kovacs said. "Yeah, he did." Morrison's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "Hell," he said finally, and turned back to his post without another word. But something had changed in him. Some fundamental certainty had been shaken. Kovacs knew that whatever happened next, whether they held the village or got overrun, Morrison would never be quite the same man he'd been before. They held. The German attack broke against their improvised defenses, the Panzer Grenadiers falling back after taking casualties they couldn't sustain. And by mid-morning, the self-propelled gun had withdrawn to find softer targets. Relief came in the afternoon, a full company moving up to take over the position, and Crawford's mixed unit of exhausted, filthy soldiers was finally pulled back to regroup and rest. They marched down the hill in loose order, white and Negro soldiers interspersed without anyone thinking about it. And when they reached the battalion assembly area, officers looked at them with expressions of confusion and something that might have been concern. A captain from division headquarters, a staff officer with clean boots and a clipboard, pulled Morrison aside and asked pointed questions about why his squad had been integrated with Negro troops. Morrison's answer was simple and devastating. "Because when the shells are falling, sir, you don't much give a damn about the color of the man next to you as long as he's shooting at the Germans and not running away." The captain made notes on his clipboard and said something about this being irregular, about needing to maintain unit cohesion and respect existing regulations. And Morrison just stared at him with eyes that had seen things the captain never would. Eyes that had watched men die and watched other men prove themselves under fire. "With respect, sir," Morrison said, and his tone carried no respect at all. "You weren't there. You didn't see." What Morrison had seen, what they'd all seen, was a truth that the Army's policy of segregation had tried to deny. Negro soldiers could fight as well as white soldiers. They could lead, could strategize, could demonstrate courage under fire that equaled or exceeded anything their white counterparts showed. The idea that they were naturally inferior, naturally suited only for support roles, naturally lacking in the qualities that made good combat soldiers, was revealed as the lie it had always been. It was a convenient fiction that served institutional racism but crumbled in the face of actual experience. But recognizing that truth and acting on it were different things entirely. The Army was a conservative institution built on hierarchy and tradition, and the idea of full integration threatened too many people's sense of how the world should work. So the mixed units that had formed in the chaos of combat were quietly broken up. The Negro soldiers returned to their own divisions, the white soldiers returned to theirs. Everyone pretended that what had happened in Sommocolonia and a dozen other places across the Italian front was an aberration, rather than a glimpse of what might be possible. Kovacs was sent to a rest area behind the lines where hot food and dry tents waited, where he could sleep for 16 hours straight and wake up with the shakes because his body had finally figured out how terrified it had been. He wrote letters home that he couldn't quite make himself send because how could he explain what he'd learned? How could he tell his mother that everything she'd taught him about the natural order of things had been wrong? The colored man she'd told him to avoid eye contact with on the street might be braver and more honorable than half the white men he'd known. He ran into Crawford one last time, 3 weeks later, at a USO show where some singer from the States was performing for the troops. The entertainment was segregated, different shows for white and Negro soldiers. They passed each other in the muddy road outside the venue, and Crawford nodded in recognition. They didn't exchange words. There was no emotional reunion or heartfelt conversation. But in that moment of acknowledgement, Kovacs felt the weight of everything that had happened between them. All the assumptions that had been challenged, all the growth that had occurred under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The war ground on. The Gothic Line was eventually breached, the Germans pushed back into the Po Valley, and in the spring of 1945 the whole rotten structure of the Third Reich finally collapsed. Kovacs survived, though survival was more a matter of luck than skill. And when he shipped home in the summer, he carried with him memories that would never quite let him rest. He thought about Crawford, wondered if the sergeant had made it through, wondered if his wife in Georgia had gotten her husband back alive, wondered what kind of life awaited a Negro veteran in the post-war South. He thought about Morrison, too, about the grudging respect the Texan had finally shown, about whether it would survive the return to civilian life or whether Morrison would slip back into the comfortable prejudices of his upbringing. Once the immediate threat of death no longer forced him to see his fellow soldiers as individuals rather than representatives of their race, Kovacs suspected he knew the answer, suspected that transformation required more than a few days of shared danger. The hatreds of a lifetime couldn't be erased by even the most profound experiences. But something had changed, something small and fragile, but real. Kovacs had seen Negro soldiers fight and die with courage equal to any he'd witnessed. He'd watched them lead under fire, watched them risk their lives to save white soldiers who'd called them degrading names. He'd watched them demonstrate every quality the Army claimed they lacked. And while he knew that knowledge wouldn't make him a crusader for equality, wouldn't turn him into some kind of hero fighting against segregation, it did mean he could never quite go back to seeing the world the way he had before. He got a job at a factory when he returned to Pittsburgh, married a nice Polish girl from the neighborhood, started a family. He didn't talk much about the war, didn't burden his children with the complicated truths he'd learned. But when the civil rights movement began to gather momentum in the late 1950s, when colored people started demanding the rights that had always been denied them, when white neighbors complained about integration and outside agitators, when they complained about the destruction of the American way of life, Kovacs kept quiet, but he didn't join in. He remembered Sommocolonia, remembered James Crawford and Thomas Washington and Davis. He remembered men who'd been every bit as American as he was, but had been forced to fight twice as hard to prove it. He read in the newspaper one day that President Truman had ordered the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948, ending the policy that had kept Negro soldiers in separate units throughout World War II. The article was brief, buried on an inside page, just a few paragraphs noting this change in policy without much commentary on what had prompted it. But Kovacs understood. The military had learned what he'd learned. What thousands of white soldiers had learned in Italy and France and the Pacific, that segregation made no military sense, that dividing your forces by race only weakened them. Courage and competence had nothing to do with skin color. It was a small victory, and it came too late for the men who'd fought in segregated units during the war, but it was something. It meant that the sacrifices of those Negro soldiers hadn't been entirely in vain, that their courage had been seen and acknowledged. The Army at least had moved beyond the comfortable lies of racial hierarchy. Whether the rest of America would follow was an open question, one that Kovacs couldn't answer. But he'd seen enough to know that change was possible, that even the most deeply held prejudices could be challenged by experience. That men who'd been taught to hate might learn to respect if the circumstances forced them to. See each other as individuals rather than symbols. The rain still fell on the Tuscan hills, washing over the graves of the men who'd fallen there, marking time with its patient erosion of stone and memory. The villages stood silent, their walls repaired, their streets empty of soldiers. The war that had seemed so important, so all-consuming, faded into history. But for men like Kovacs, for the survivors who carried those days with them like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove, the memory remained vivid and necessary. They had seen something that the civilians back home would never understand, had witnessed a truth that challenged everything their society had taught them. And even if they couldn't articulate it, even if they couldn't always live up to what they'd learned, they knew. They knew that Sergeant James Crawford had been a better soldier and a better man than most white officers who'd commanded him. They knew that Thomas Washington had been as capable and intelligent as any white private. Davis had demonstrated courage that deserved recognition and honor rather than dismissal and prejudice. They knew that the Army's policy of segregation had wasted talent and courage, had forced men to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. It had served the ideological needs of racism rather than the practical needs of military effectiveness. And while knowing these things didn't make them heroes, didn't automatically translate into action or advocacy, it did plant seeds of doubt that would, in some men, eventually bloom into something like understanding. The transformation wasn't universal, wasn't even common. Most white soldiers who'd fought alongside Negro troops returned to civilian life and resumed the prejudices of their upbringing with barely a ripple of discomfort. Morrison probably went back to Texas and never thought twice about maintaining segregation, about keeping colored people in their place, about defending the social order he'd been raised to believe was natural and right. Kowalski probably went back to Chicago and told his friends at the bar that, yeah, he'd fought with some Negro soldiers in Italy. They weren't too bad considering, but that didn't mean he wanted them moving into his neighborhood or dating his sister. But here and there, in individual men scattered across the country, something stuck. Some memory of courage witnessed, some moment of shared humanity that couldn't quite be dismissed or explained away. Some recognition that the lie of racial inferiority had been exposed as precisely that, a lie, and that once you'd seen the truth, you could never completely unsee it no matter how hard you tried. These men didn't become activists, didn't march in protests or write letters to their congressmen, but when their children asked them about the war, some of them told stories that were more complicated than simple tales of American heroism. Stories that acknowledged the courage of Negro soldiers who'd been asked to fight for a country that didn't treat them as full citizens. Kovacs was one of these men. He didn't make a big deal of it, didn't lecture or preach, but when his son came home from college in 1963 talking about the March on Washington, about Martin Luther King and civil rights and the moral necessity of ending segregation, Kovacs listened. He listened in a way his own father never would have, listened with the understanding that came from having fought alongside men whose skin was a different color, but whose dreams and fears and hopes were fundamentally the same as his own. And when his son asked him directly if he thought colored people deserved equal rights, Kovacs thought about Sommocolonia, about Crawford and Washington and Davis, about men who'd been brave when bravery was needed and had asked for nothing in return except the basic dignity of being recognized as fully human. "Yeah," he said finally, the word coming out rough around the edges but sincere. "Yeah, I do. It wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough to balance the scales or undo the damage of centuries of racism and oppression. One man's change of heart couldn't alter the massive structural inequalities that defined American society. It couldn't give back the opportunities denied or the lives destroyed or the potential wasted. But it was something, a small crack in the edifice of prejudice, a recognition that experience could challenge ideology, and that men were capable of growth even when their society actively discouraged it. The war had been fought to defeat fascism, to stop Hitler's genocidal ambitions and protect democracy from totalitarian evil. And America had emerged victorious, proud of its role as the arsenal of democracy and defender of freedom. But for Negro soldiers who'd fought in that war, who'd risked their lives for a country that denied them basic civil rights, who'd proven their courage and competence only to return home to segregation and discrimination and violence, that victory was bittersweet at best. They had served with honor, had demonstrated all the qualities that supposedly defined good Americans, and had been rewarded with continued second-class citizenship and the knowledge that white society would rather maintain comfortable lies than acknowledge uncomfortable truths. The story of what happened when white soldiers first served alongside Negro troops in World War II is a story of many things. It's a story of institutional racism confronting practical necessity, of ideology being challenged by experience, of individuals being forced to question assumptions they'd never thought to examine. It's a story with no clear heroes, no simple resolutions, no moment when everything changed and America suddenly recognized the humanity and equality of all its citizens. It's a messy, complicated story of incremental change and persistent resistance, of small victories and massive structural failures, of men who learned but didn't act and men who acted but couldn't change enough. But it's also a story of courage, not just the courage to face enemy fire, but the courage to recognize your own prejudices and begin the slow, painful work of overcoming them. It's a story of men like James Crawford who fought for a country that didn't fully accept them because they believed in what that country could become rather than what it was. It's a story of men like Daniel Kovacs who had their worldview challenged and managed, even if incompletely, to grow beyond the narrow confines of their upbringing. And it's a story that reminds us that transformation is possible, that even the most deeply entrenched systems of oppression can be challenged, that individual experiences matter even when they don't immediately translate into social change. The rain continued to fall on the Tuscan hills as it had fallen for centuries and would fall for centuries more, indifferent to human drama and human meaning. The war became history. The participants aged and died. New generations were born who would fight their own battles for equality and justice. But the truth that those white soldiers discovered in Sommocolonia and 100 other places remained, buried in memory but not erased, a testament to what men could see when circumstances forced them to look beyond the comfortable illusions of their prejudices and encounter the simple, undeniable reality of shared humanity under fire.